Hello and welcome to another online seminar. Now today I want to look at what drive is and why drive differs from instinct, what the nature of desire is, and even touch on why we as human beings often engage in self-destructive behaviour. This is a little taster of some of the things I'm looking at the moment in my more in-depth seminars on my Patreon page. But I do want to cover some of that stuff here on these shorter seminars. I also want to do this because I kind of want to address why evolutionary theories of culture and religion feel so shallow. Why is it that evolutionary theories that attempt to do justice to the nature of religion kind of fall short? So we're going to try and cover all of that. The first thing I want to do is look at the difference between nature and culture. So at the moment, as you see, I've got a whiteboard. I spent a bit of time nailing this to the wall so as to be able to kind of like draw diagrams as I'm doing the seminar. And by the way, the diagram that I'm going to be using today is largely influenced by this book here by Deporter, called Christ in Postmodern Philosophy. He has a great chapter in this book on Slavoj Žižek. It's really a brilliant chapter and I'd really highly recommend it. And in this chapter he uses some diagrams to explain what he's talking about. So I'm going to use that as a basis. I might add some dimensions or elements that aren't in the book, but basically that's where I'm getting the idea. In this, we're going to look a little bit at Žižek, we're going to use a little bit of Freud, and primarily I want to give a background to kind of how paratheology approaches the subject of religion. So we have nature first. Nature can be broadly described as the realm of instinct. So whenever we think about animals, we think about instincts, and an instinct is a strong movement towards a particular thing that is in the service of life. So for example, food, sustenance, shelter, or mating. Animals will have these strong instincts towards these objects. And once they get the food, the shelter, the mating, then that satisfies the instinct. So that's kind of the natural world. And then we have culture. And culture is what we live in, civilization. And the common sense notion is that human beings have instincts, we have natural desires, and in order to develop civilization, we needed to develop the law. So the movement between nature and culture is through law. And law is basically the social contract. Human beings, at some stage, these animals got together and through the evolution of the brain, got to a level of complexity where we were able to develop stronger communities. We were able to develop tools. We were able to advance in a variety of ways. But in order to do that, we needed a social contract to keep our natural desires in check. Because without keeping our natural desires in check, we were likely to end up stealing from each other, end up doing violence to other people, kind of end up basically in a war of all against all. As Hobbes says, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. So, culture is a type of renaturalization for human beings. Through the law, humans' desires and instincts are curtailed, they're managed, they're manipulated in order to create a society. And we have things like laws, we have courts, we have prisons that are designed to punish those who don't stay true to the social contract. Now, the law, don't think of the law primarily in terms of the given laws of a culture. Law here is much broader than that. It is basically the set of conditions that we all implicitly or explicitly agree to in order to live together. So there are laws everywhere. Whenever you grow up in a family, there are spoken and unspoken laws. In parties, if you go out to a party, a social engagement, there's all types of rules that kind of dictate the type of behavior you should have, whether you should bring a bottle of wine, whether you should return an invite to the people who have invited you, what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. And depending on the type of party, those rules change. And then, of course, within states, within countries, you also have rules. And although rules do a whole pile of things, at their most abstract, they are designed to maintain the functioning of society through the curtailment of our natural instincts. Now, this is the notion that psychoanalytic theory kind of fundamentally rejects, right? The idea of the law in psychoanalysis is not to curtail our natural desires and our natural instincts. Actually, the law is designed to tarry with and manipulate and domesticate unnatural desires, a perverse desire that is very unique to human beings. And this Freud called drive. Now, drive is similar to instinct in the sense that it is kind of as strong as an instinct. It's kind of perverse instinct. So in the same way that an animal, if an animal wants to mate and it's that time where it should be mating and it can't, you'll see the animal basically go a bit crazy. There's this strong desire to mate. And drive is similar. It is this overwhelming, overpowering urge. But unlike instinct, drive is not connected to a particular object. Human beings can have a drive towards literally anything. It can be, of course, gambling, it can be drugs, it can be alcohol, it can be sex, it can be stamp collecting, it can be cars, it can be houses, it can be money. There's no limit to what we can have a drive towards. So the first thing to think about it with drive is it's like instinct but derailed from some sort of particular thing. Secondly, instinct has a particular object, right? Instinct goes for, say, food or shelter or mating, very simple things. But the second thing about drive is drive does not have a particular object that will satisfy it. What drive does is it revolves around things. It's insatiable. It wants more and more and more. So say, for example, gambling. No matter how much you gamble, no matter how much you win, you want to go back and gamble more, right? Or sex. If sex is this drive, then no matter how much you get, you just want more. Or food. If food is a drive for you, you eat beyond the amount of food that you need for your biological system, or you eat too little, you eat nothingness itself. So drive can be connected to these things, but the difference between instinct and drive is an instinct for food is satisfied when you eat enough to survive, but drive is where there's no limit. You can't eat enough. And of course, physically, you get to a point where you literally can't eat anymore, but then the next day you go back and you keep going back and you keep going back. And the difference between instinct and drive then, is third thing, is that instincts are in the service of life. They're utilitarian. So animals are great utilitarians. They maximize their pleasure, they minimize their pain. But drive is in the service of destruction, in the service of death. Drive brings us, what Freud called it, beyond the pleasure principle. Drive brings us beyond what's enjoyable. So even say it's a drive for money, and you want more and more and more. There's a certain point when you could stop and you could enjoy the money you have. But if you have this insatiable drive for the increase of capital, then you will give yourself over to that until you die. You will destroy families, you will destroy your friends, you will deceive people, you will give yourself stress and ultimately a heart attack. All of these things, there's no limit to the insatiable need for more and more and more. So instincts are in the service of life, but drives are kind of in the service of death. Now it's a funny kind of death because it's a when your drives are like a exuberance. They're what make you passionate. So there's an eternal life nature to it. There's this intensity of life to it, but that intensity of life brings us beyond the pleasure principle into what in psychoanalysis is called jouissance, which is a painful pleasure, a pleasure that is suffering. And culture and religion are less interested in curtailing and dealing with our natural instincts as they are with managing and articulating and manipulating often our unnatural drives. So obviously in Christianity it's called sin, right? In psychoanalysis it's called death drive. But religion is more interested in this beyond the pleasure principle, this insatiable drive that we have, than it is with these very natural things. We are derailed subjects. So in kind of the creation story of psychoanalysis, the idea is that at some point in evolution, certain animals suffered from a derailment. So it's not so much that human beings are an evolutionary advantage over other animals. Of course, we have more complex brains, and that probably led to this problem. But in some ways, human beings are a catastrophe. They are a derailment of evolutionary theory. And basically what it is that at some point, some animals started suffering from psychosis, a profound and radical psychosis. And psychosis, in a sense, is where you begin to get a very primitive sense of self, sense of ego, sense of being separated from the world. But that is overwhelmed by the over proximity of the world. So, I mean, at its simplest, it's just there is a point when animals begin to get a sense of self, but that sense of self is so under threat and so weak and so chaotic and so inundated with the external world that it causes, I say, this kind of psychosis. And so what happens as a defense against this derailment, this horror, is the law. The law comes in order to help us overcome this psychotic terror that arises out of nature. Now, in a very simple way, you can just think about it like a child. There's a point when an infant starts to get a sense of selfhood, but it is very primitive. It's around, it's called the mirror phase, maybe 3 months, maybe 3 to 6 months old. The child begins to develop a sense of self, which is separation from the mother. So at first, the child doesn't have a sense of self. There's just a body of emotions and feelings, explosions in the body with no way to define what they are. There isn't hunger and thirst and all of those things. There are just like explosions of feeling without center. And then an ego starts to form. So those feelings and explosions within the body begin to coalesce. We begin to make sense of them through the help of outside, through the help of our mother and our father. And this experience is pretty traumatic. Paul Tillich called it ontic shock, right? This shock of us as beings in the world. And what we often want to do, or what our natural instinct is, to return to the oneness that we've lost, to go back to some sort of primordial ground of being. Now, the difficulty is we can't go back to that because we didn't exist. We, as in the subject, the self, comes into existence primarily in separation. It's not so much that I am separated from the rest of the world. It's that my being, my selfhood, is the separation itself. If there was no separation between me and the world, there would be no me. There would just be a body experiencing the world without a center. So as the individual starts to get a center, a sense of ego, there can be a desire to return to something that cannot be returned to. The law comes in and says no. You can't go back. Now, within the family, this is kind of like the weaning process, or the weaning process is one example of it, where a child has to be separated physically from their primary caregiver, often from their mother's breast. They have to learn to be a separate entity, so there's this utter interdependence, utter dependence, which then begins to separate and you become an individual self. And that's the law. That's the earliest instantiation of the law. It is the no. You cannot return to your mother's womb. There is no way back, right? That is the no. You have to satisfy yourself with something else. So here's you. This is, say, your mother. It's you. There's a separation and there's a desire to return. And the law is here. It says you can't go back, right? Now then, what you want to do is you want to go back, but you can't, right? So the law is, you have to be satisfied with other things. So you satisfy yourself with toys, with other friends, with kind of like doing other things, right? So these are other satisfactions. What you really want is to get back to the oceanic oneness, but you can't do that. You're not allowed to. So you satisfy yourself with other things. This is desire. And this is drive. Now, the law which separates you, which causes this separation, the trick is it doesn't separate you from anything, right? It brings a separation, but you are not separated from the thing. You are born in the separation. So what happens is when the law comes into being, it does something weird. It says you can't go back to oneness. You can't have that oceanic satisfaction and fullness that you would like, that you feel you're lacking. And because of that, we start to fantasize that there is something that can give us satisfaction, completeness, wholeness, and fullness. And this is called the thing. So the thing is what promises wholeness and completeness in your life, what seems to hold out the possibility of full satisfaction if only you could get to it. But this is only created through a fantasy. The law, which is here, generates a fantasy. And the fantasy is for something that will make you whole. So let me make this concrete for a second. Perhaps you want a full sexual relationship. You're imagining all these crazy things you could do. If you could have full sexual satisfaction with somebody. But you can't, right? Because maybe you would feel guilty, or you'd be judged by your family or friends if you were going out with multiple people and doing all this crazy stuff. So there's all these prohibitions that say you can't just go out and do everything you want to do sexually. So that's a prohibition. Then you have these fantasies about this amazing kind of sexual life that you could have, but you renounce it, and you satisfy yourself with a partner. Maybe you're going out with your partner, you've been going out with them for years, and there's certain sexual satisfaction, but it's also dissatisfaction. It's never as good as what you would like. Or if you think about the bridges of Madison County, if you've read the book or you've seen the film, there's a woman who, she's married, and her marriage is pretty dissatisfying. There's not much going on, And then this photographer comes into town, Clint Eastwood in the film, and he's like everything she wants, but she can't be with him because of the law. The law is, her community would judge her, her friends would judge her, she's married, she has kids, all of these things that get in the way. But they simply feed the fantasy that if she was with him, everything would be amazing. So she has a choice: follow the drive, get the thing, Clint Eastwood, right? Or renounce Clint Eastwood and stay with her husband and have a bit of satisfaction, but also a profound dissatisfaction, and take Valium or whatever. And of course, in the movie, which plays this out, they create a kind of an obscurantist, kind of spiritualist ending where at the end of her life she dies and her ashes are sprinkled at the bridges of Madison County where they met. So this is like the movie is a way of symbolizing this structure. And you can put any number of things kind of in this. Now the problem is if she did end up with Clint Eastwood, she wouldn't be happy. If she ended up transgressing the law, going through her fantasy and getting the thing, it would be a disaster. I think he's been married before, he's traveling all over the place. There'd be a terrible fit, within a few months they would be fighting with each other, and within 6 months they would hate each other, right? So this is the weird thing, is you really have a drive for something, but if you got it would disappear, because this is a fantasy. There is nothing here but a void that is fueled by a fantasy. But people do break through. People who give themselves over to the drive are people who engage in transgressive behaviors, because the transgressive behavior is the very thing that fuels the idea that something is out there that can satisfy you. I mean, the best example is when you get drunk. There's a phrase, in vino veritas, which means in wine there is truth. Now, what kind of truth is in wine? Now, on a simple level, you could say, oh, it means that if you have a few drinks, you're more likely to tell people what you really think. But I think at a deeper level, in being drunk, the truth of your jouissance comes out. So whenever you have a few drinks, you're more likely to eat food that's bad for you, smoke, you're more likely to have unprotected sex, all of these things. And smoking's a good example, actually. What is smoking? Well, smoking is in a sense a transgressive thing, because smoking is inherently bad for you, right? It's something that you're killing yourself by doing it, and people think that that's the bad thing. We should, the fact that you're going to die from smoking is the thing that should put you off, but actually it's the very thing that makes smoking so desirable. Right? It's the very transgressive nature of it. You're transgressing the life instinct. You're doing something that you shouldn't do, right? It's like, voting for Trump or something like that. You've got to understand it's the transgressive element which is so appealing. Now, this desire is connected to what's called the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle is doing things that are good for you. If you get up early, you keep fit, you read a book, you talk to your friends, you do healthy things. That's a pleasure principle, right? You're restricting your jouissance and you're doing things that are good for you and things that maybe make you feel good. Beyond the pleasure principle is whenever you start to do behaviors that are bad for you, that are damaging for you. And we all have this drive, so we all do it. It might be extreme sports, smoking, eating fast food. And we think that, as I say, we think that the bad part of those things kind of puts us off, but it's the bad parts of those things that actually makes them so intriguing. It's the danger in dangerous sports. It's like, so smoking is a great thing because there's very little pleasure in smoking. Very little pleasure. I mean, there might be a little bit in terms of like you smoke so you get to go out of your office for 5 minutes, take a break, and that's pleasurable. Or the social dimension, you're at a bar, you go out the back, you have a smoke and you can get talking to people. So there are small elements of pleasure in smoking, but smoking is mostly beyond the pleasure principle. It is the thing that is pure danger. The only thing that makes it pleasurable, this weird thing of lighting up this stick and then smoking ash into your lungs, is precisely the transgressive dimension of it. In the film that I'm producing, is coming out next week actually, called Making Love. There's a line in it, one of my favourite lines, and it's actually stolen from a friend of mine in Belfast called Nick, because he told me he was smoking one time and somebody said to him, you should try patches. With patches it's all of the nicotine, none of the death. And Nick said to the guy, but that's my favourite ingredient. And I really like that line. It's kind of like, the favourite ingredient of smoking is the death. I'd be interested to see if smoking went up or down whenever it finally was discovered that it was bad for you, right? So there's this transgressive nature, which means human beings are terrible utilitarians, right? Animals are great utilitarians, but humans aren't. This is one of the major problems with utilitarian theory, is the Freudian death drive, is that we can engage in behavior that we know is self-destructive, that is beyond the utilitarian principle. Jacques-Alain Miller, a French theorist, he used a great example of this, where he talked about a scientific experiment that was done where they put some mice in a cage. So imagine this is a cage, and they've got some mice here. And in this cage, there's some food. So imagine this is some food that the mice can eat. But here is some really great food, like something that the mice would really want. This is pretty rubbish, and that's really, really nice food, right? So what happened? Well, the mice went up, they tried to get the good food, but there is this barrier in the way, a glass barrier, so they couldn't get it. So they tried a few times, and then they walked off and they ate this food, right? They had no problem renouncing this nicer food. Think about it like a dog on a leash. You're walking your dog, and your dog is pulling a certain direction because there's something they want. But then you tug them, and you tug them enough, and then eventually they go, oh, fair enough, and then they walk the other direction, right? But then the scientists took the mice out of the cage, did scientist things, right? Somehow played with their brains in a Frankenstein way, put the mice back in the cage. And what happened was the mice went for the thing, the food, but they wouldn't renounce it. They kept bouncing against the glass until they died. So what they happened is they made little humans out of the mice, right? They wouldn't renounce the thing to their own destruction, to their own detriment. This, of course, is what zombies are. You know, one of the reasons why zombies are so interesting culturally is because they are pure drive without desire. So a zombie is a human being stripped of all desire, pure drive for flesh. So a zombie will go at you, even if you have a shotgun and you shoot them, and as long as they can walk, as long as they can move, they will not stop. It's a perverse type of selflessness. Selflessness as in they are not thinking of their self, they are just thinking about the thing. And so in The Walking Dead, of course, we are the zombies. The zombie virus is inside us, because that's the truth of zombie films, is we are the zombies. There is a zombie drive. And in Walking Dead, once you die, the human part of you dies, and all that remains is sheer drive. So the zombie is sheer drive. Okay, so the law, the two things to remember about the law is the law stops you from getting the thing and also creates the thing. It is what prevents you from getting this and also brings it into existence, along with fantasy in the law. And I say it could be anything. Now, within our contemporary ideological system, our consumerist capitalist world, we see how this operates. You have the accumulation of capital. You have the desire to accumulate more money, and it's insatiable. There's no end to it. You can't, once you make a certain amount of money, you don't stop. You just want to make more. So there is this drive to increase capital. The thing is maybe through fantasy is this amazing house you could have, private jets, living by the beach, all of this stuff that you're imagining. So a fantasy fills in the lack, tells you what you want, but ultimately you just want this. Some people break the transgression, break the law to get the money. And by the law, I just mean social convention. Like the law of good taste, like getting married or having friends or like treating people well, because to amass a lot of money, you can't amass a lot of money without breaking a lot of eggs, right? Whether you're manipulating people, not paying them enough, using sweatshops in another country, or betting against companies, or whatever you're doing, there are certain things you have to transgress. And the more you transgress and the more money you get, just the more obsessed you get with more and more and more. The drive is never fulfilled. Or you renounce that and you try to be satisfied with your job and the amount of money you have, and a little promotion here, a little holiday there, a slightly nicer house. So it's a wee bit of satisfaction, but always less than the full satisfaction that you fantasize about, that you imagine you could have. Now, desire and drive are intimately interconnected. So desire, in a sense, is what's left over from drive. It's like once you renounce drive, you've got this paltry stuff that has meaning because of what you've renounced. It's like a little bit less than what you would really like. So these two things are very intertwined. Now, in religion, it's the same thing. In religion, the thing is God. And, there's the drive to be one with God, the psychotic drive or fundamentalism or whatever, which is this idea that you can have the mind of God and be one with God. Or you've got lots of religious practices that say you can't have that in this life, right? You can't get that. In fact, if you get it, you'll just go insane. You'll think you hear the God and you'll end up doing something terrible. So what you've got to do is satisfy yourself with prayer and fasting, reading the Bible, doing good works. And, these are not getting you the thing, but they're they give you some satisfaction. They give you something until you get that, maybe in the next life. But of course, as I say, you will have some people driven to that. So whereas these people, maybe pray for 15 minutes a day and fast once a week or whatever, the person who is driven to the oneness with God, they'll be praying 5 hours a day. They'll be doing all night prayer stuff. They'll be fasting 5 days a week. Then they'll push to 10 days and they'll push themselves to these excesses of death, right? That's where, this drive, and the more they break through, the more they have to do, the more that they have to find the next transgression to break through in order to keep the whole fantasy alive. Now, in Theology, the idea is, how do we destroy this entire mode of desire, this entire desiring framework? This is what is religionless Christianity. This is what Theology is it's not trying to get the thing or renounce your desire and be unhappy with crappy stuff, which is, by the way, this is like Schopenhauer. When Schopenhauer said human beings live between, he said boredom and pain, but we could basically say between depression and melancholy. Depression is the unhappiness of not getting what you want, so depression is here. Melancholy is the depression of getting what you want, which is here. So this is melancholy and this is depression, broadly speaking. Both, this is like a no-win situation between a rock and a hard place. What does it mean to smash this entire structure and live in a different way? And this brings us to a concept called the objet petit a. But we won't go into that today. I will probably do a separate seminar on objet petit a and how it differs, and it allows us a way out of this problem. But for now, if you're interested in this stuff, all you've got to remember is drive, desire, the definition of nature and culture, law, difference between instinct and drive, we've covered, fantasy, law. We talked a little bit about jouissance. Jouissance is just what's called beyond the pleasure principle, the type of pleasure we get from our own suffering. And there's healthy and unhealthy ways of engaging with that. That's, by the way, what objet petit a is. You could describe it as a more healthy way of managing your drive. The thing is an unhealthy way of managing your drive. And within Theology, there is a theory and a practice that is designed to get you out of this. Okay, so anyway, there'll be a part 2 at some point, and we'll give you the answer. So take care. Thanks for listening. Bye.